Hello, and welcome to our session of the Mountain States Regional Genetics Summit 2021. I'm Kathy Hessel, one of the co-project directors for our network, and I'm glad you're able to join us today for the session entitled, When It Comes to Your Health, Does Your Zip Code Matter More Than Your Genetic Code? Our presenter today is Dr. Tony Iton, the Senior Vice President for the California Endowment. Please reference your screen for the accreditation and disclosure statements, which can also be found under the CEU tab on the website. Dr. Iton, we're looking forward to your presentation.
Hello, I have 30 minutes with you guys today, and so I am not going to waste any time. I'm going to jump right into this and share my screen there. Okay, so again, hello. I'm in sunny California today, although we've had a bit of rain, and I'm going to sort of take you on a kind of a whirlwind journey through discovery of what is really at the basis of health. What is the genesis of health? And this is my experience, and hopefully it'll resonate for most of you. I'm a lawyer as well as a doctor, and one of the things you learn in law school is to state your conclusions up front. So I'm just going to tell you my conclusions. This is actually one of my false conclusions, and that is that health is behavioral. This is kind of one of the dominant paradigms in health. The second one is that health is transactional, which basically means it's the quality and frequency of medical services that determines health. And the third is that health is genetic. These are the dominant paradigms in health and healthcare today, and they shape our policy in trying to improve our population's health. And I'm going to argue to you that they're right, but they're wrong on the macro level. These are micro level concepts, but they don't explain population health statistics that we see and are concerned about. They're really individual level frames. What I'm going to argue to you today, again, quickly, is that health is in fact political. And when I say political, the P is small. And one definition of politics is it's a struggle over the allocation of limited and precious social goods. And those limited and precious social goods may be things like a park or a grocery store in your neighborhood. These are health protective resources that are allocated in political processes at the local, regional, state, and sometimes federal level. And if health is small p political, I'm not talking about partisan politics, it means that power matters. Power matters at the individual level, the community level, in order for people to be able to access the resources to navigate a healthy life. Another conclusion, this is a real conclusion, health is not healthcare. I think many of you know that. Where you live matters, and it matters a lot. I'm going to try to prove that to you. And finally, health is an investment, a collective investment, and the countries that have figured that out have strong social contracts. And I'm going to give you an example of one, and then really ask you, what is the American social contract? Because I literally don't know. But to jump right into this, I like to provoke people a little bit because I think it's important for you to be kind of on your toes when talking about this stuff, because everything's on the table. I'm going to read you this quote. I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races, that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this, there's a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. You may be surprised by this, but that was Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator. And many of us have been to the Lincoln Memorial up on the mall, and you see the second inaugural address and the Gettysburg Address carved into marble in the Lincoln Memorial, but you don't see Lincoln's frankly white supremacist words carved into that marble. And the question that I'm putting right out in front of you is why? Why don't we talk about Lincoln's white supremacist ideology? In the same speech, this was 1858 when he was debating William Douglas in the so-called Lincoln-Douglas debates when he was running for Senate in Illinois. He said, "Our Republican system was meant for a homogeneous people. As long as Blacks continue to live with the whites, they constitute a threat to the national life. Family life may also collapse, and the increase of mixed breed bastards may someday challenge the supremacy of the white man." Okay, so I'm setting this up for you a little bit to make the point that narrative, the story we tell ourselves about who we are, what is our national identity, who belongs, that narrative shapes policy, and that policy creates real world conditions that relate to health. That's the whole thesis of this conversation. Let me take you through it. There's themes that run through our society: income inequality, mass incarceration, student protests, a refugee crisis here and around the world, Black Lives Matter, Moral Mondays in North Carolina, Indigenous people's rights, Standing Rock, undocumented movements, anti-Asian racism movements, marriage equality. All of these efforts, these campaigns have themes that run through them, and the themes are exclusion. We are being excluded. We're not being allowed to have access to the full fruits of this society, and that is not what America is. And therefore, we want to make change. There's a narrative of exclusion, and Lincoln's narrative was a narrative of exclusion. It was a white supremacist narrative. It basically said that certain people belong and other people don't. The narrative of exclusion does three simple things. The first thing it does is it intentionally dehumanizes the target. Lincoln talked about a physical difference between the white and Black races. A former president talked about Mexican Americans as bringing drugs, bringing crime, being rapists. We've heard other politicians talk about makers versus takers, or the 47%, or super predators, or crack babies. There's an intentional dehumanization of the targets of that speech. The second thing that a narrative of exclusion does is it exaggerates this notion of scarcity, and it suggests that we live in a zero-sum competition between competing tribes, and anything that that tribe gets means that they had to take it from us. So the name of the game is to protect your tribe and to keep stuff for your tribe. And then the third thing that the narrative of exclusion does is it defines America very narrowly. It looks back historically with great nostalgia. It ignores some of the obvious atrocities that have happened in the history of this country, and it looks to the future with fear. Narratives are extremely powerful motivators of behavior. As I said, they shape policy, and policy creates conditions. Narratives motivate people to take extreme actions. They're extremely powerful. Who belongs? Who is this country for? Who has the right to claim the benefits of policies that are made collectively? That's what narrative is about. There's a competing narrative in this country, and there are really only two fundamental narratives: a narrative of exclusion and a narrative of inclusion. The narrative of inclusion does three things, but they're slightly different. One is it changes the narrator and allows people to tell their own story, to humanize themselves so that we see our shared humanity. Their story resonates with us with our own stories. It broadens the lens to show that our fates are inextricably intertwined, and it looks to the past realistically, and it talks about slavery and Native American genocide and the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese internment. It talks about those realistically, and it recognizes that we can't move forward the way that we've gotten here. So those are two competing narratives, and those, at the end of the day, are what determine the fundamental health policies that create real-world conditions for people all over this country. Now, let me tell you a little bit about my story. I grew up in a country that is a beautiful place with great housing stock, parks, street cafes, state-of-the-art public transportation. This is Montreal, Canada, looking down on McGill University in the downtown Montreal in the background, the St. Lawrence River you can see just on the skyline there. Canada has a very strong social contract, an agreement between the citizens and the government about what kind of investments the government should prioritize. It has universal health care, universal dental care for children, universal child care benefits, paid sick leave for all Americans. We're still debating that, or all Canadians. We're still debating that, obviously, in the US. State-of-the-art public transportation in most of the major cities, highly subsidized post-secondary education, and high quality community resources. Note the word universal. If you're looking for the strength of a country's social contract, just look for one word, and that word is universal. That means that there's a sense of shared solidarity across populations, that people recognize that there's a common good and that it needs to be invested in. In the mid-1980s, I left Montreal. I was told that Johns Hopkins Medical School was the best medical school in the world, so I decided to go there. And this is what I encountered when I arrived in Baltimore, settings that I had never before seen in my life. In fact, it looked to me like a war zone. I said that to a person who was touring me around, and I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "What do you expect? It's the inner city." And I said to myself, well, what if I had grown up in East Baltimore? What, for all intents and purposes, that child is me. And this child had no hand in creating the environment in which he grew up, no more so than I had a hand in creating the environment, the nurturing environment in Montreal, Canada, in which I grew up. If I had grown up like this child, would I have been able to go to Johns Hopkins Medical School? And I think the answer is probably no. Later in my travels, I came across some other parts of the United States. This is southern Indiana, Austin, Indiana, Scott County, which for a point in time in 2015, when Mike Pence was the governor and our former Surgeon General Jerome Adams was the state health commissioner, Scott County, Indiana had the dubious distinction of having the world's highest HIV incidence rate. And it was in the throes of an opioid epidemic where people were sharing needles and spreading HIV and hepatitis C and causing dramatic incidents of HIV and hepatitis C. And Scott County, Indiana is 98% white. When I went to Indiana and saw these conditions, what immediately occurred to me was that this was the same as East Baltimore. And in fact, this was American income inequality, two sides of the same coin, the white and black faces of income inequality in the United States. And it had profound health consequences because we leave people socially vulnerable. And when they're socially vulnerable, they're vulnerable to disease. So the question for me was, what is the American social contract? And in fact, in the United States, when it comes to your health, does your zip code matter more than your genetic code? And I set out to try to prove that to myself. I ended up in the San Francisco Bay Area. This is San Francisco. This large county to the east is Alameda County, where I became the health director and health officer. And the health director and health officer is the guardian of all, the registrar of all deaths and births. There are about 20,000 births, 10,000 deaths in Alameda County every year. And every death certificate has what somebody died of, their age when they died, their race, and where they lived. And you can take those 4 pieces of data and paint a pretty compelling picture of patterns of death in a community. So this is Alameda County now. That's got about 150 census tracts. And we calculated based on about a quarter of that was actually 400,000 death certificates. We calculated on average how long somebody could expect to live in their neighborhood, in their census tract. And in those red areas, people could only expect to live to about 74 years. The green were above 80 years, and the yellow was between 74 and 80 years. And you see that the red is concentrated in certain geographic areas. That map got a lot of attention. It ended up on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle. And it led us to go around the country working with other health departments to replicate the analysis. I had to go back to Baltimore. There were neighborhoods in Baltimore with life expectancies of 58 years, and then other neighborhoods in the same city with life expectancies approaching 90 years. We went to Cleveland, Cuyahoga County. They had a neighborhood called Huff in East Cleveland with a life expectancy of 61 years, and 1.8 miles down the road in Lyndhurst, a life expectancy of 88.5 years. Similar differences were found in New York City, in Seattle, King County, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Boston, Philadelphia, San Antonio, Denver, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Chicago. Everywhere we looked, we found these differences, 15, 20, 25, in some cases over 30 years of life expectancy difference on average in the same city. This is the American pattern. This is not an unusual thing. This is how we segregate people and stratify access to opportunity. It is by place. You can also take, if you're an epidemiologist and junkie like me who likes to play with data, you can take the map of life expectancy and poverty correlate them, just do a bivariate correlation. Each of those blue dots now is a census tract in Alameda County or a neighborhood. As you move from left to right, you're moving from relatively wealthy neighborhoods to relatively poor neighborhoods. And you're looking at life expectancy and the poverty rate of that neighborhood. And you see as you get into poorer and poorer neighborhoods, life gets correspondingly shorter and shorter. In an ideal world, how poor your neighborhood is wouldn't predict how long you live, but we don't live in an ideal world where that would be a flat line. There's a cost to living in a poor neighborhood, and you can measure it in essentially years of life lost. We've done some sophisticated analysis looking at various counties in California, doing the same analysis, looking at the slope of these respective lines of these counties, and then comparing them to Canadian metropolitan areas. What we've seen is when you aggregate all the California counties up on the top and the Canadian metropolitan areas on the bottom, you see this difference in the slope of those lines. As you move from richer to poorer in Canada, life does get shorter, but not nearly as quickly as in California counties and presumably in other American places as well. A big question comes up when you look at this data, is this really about, people of color, people who, are immigrants, people who come from countries where they have less wealth, and therefore when they come here, they're less healthy. And that in fact is a hypothesis that some physicians have put to me, and I've set out to try to see if that's true, and it's in fact not true. We all know this data. This is looking at per capita spending on medical care across developed countries. And the United States is that first large bar graph. And whenever you compare the United States to the rest of the world, you have to change the axis of the graph to fit the US on with the rest of the world. You've seen that. You may not have seen this. This is the work of two brilliant researchers who took that same data. It's now in the blue, per capita spending on medical care, but they added to it per capita spending on social services and benefits. In other words, the social contract in these respective countries, the amount of per capita money invested by the governments in these developed countries. And you see when you add per capita medical care spending and per capita social benefit spending, you see the United States is actually not the big spender. We're actually comfortably in the middle of the pack of other developed countries. But when you look at our line, you see disproportionate expenditure on medical care and an under expenditure on social benefits and services. You could argue that America has the accent on the wrong syllable. These researchers showed that the optimal ratio for social benefit spending to healthcare spending was roughly for every dollar on healthcare, the healthiest society spent about $2 on social services and benefits. In the United States, we've got it completely flipped around. For every dollar we spend on medical care, we only spend about 55 cents on social services. Their study was so provocative that the Rand Corporation replicated it, found that it was in fact truer than they even had thought. They looked at many more countries. They looked at the individual states in the United States, and they showed that those states that invest more on social benefits and services compared to medical care actually have better health. So if you want better health, you've got to invest actually in social benefits and services, i.e., you have to invest in strengthening your social contract. So this is what Rand said. Higher levels of social spending are strongly associated with better health. The association is particularly strong for public, which means government spending as opposed to private social spending. The association is particularly strong in places where income inequality is greatest. The United States has the highest income inequality in the developed world. And then finally, they looked at all of the various states, and they said that those states that spend more on social benefits have better health. Okay. People have always also asked me, well, white Americans are healthy, so this is really not a problem for whites. This is a problem for people of color. And so I looked at the data, and US white life expectancy, it's gone down a little bit as everybody else's with COVID, but pre-COVID, it was about 78.8 years. So I rounded up to 79 years, which is about the same as Croatia and Estonia for white Americans. The US whites are living shorter lives than the Maldives, Peru, Belgium, Chile, Costa Rica, Denmark, Greece, Slovenia, the UK, Austria, of course, Canada, Finland, Germany, Iceland, Ireland, Luxembourg, Malta, Netherlands, New Zealand, Portugal, Sweden, Australia, Cyprus, Israel, Italy, France, Norway, South Korea, Singapore, Spain, Switzerland, and Japan. There are 32 countries in the world with longer life expectancy than US whites. In 1990, there were only 17. US white life expectancy is actually plummeting. It's in free fall. It's so bad that many health researchers now are no longer looking at whites as a benchmark when they're looking at health disparities. We're better off using immigrant Asians or immigrant Latinos, or quite frankly, immigrant anybody. Every immigrant population to the United States has better health and life expectancy than their American-born peers. And the crazy thing is, as they become more American, as they acculturate, their health actually gets worse. America is not good for your health. Don't believe me. You can believe the Institute of Medicine, or what's now the National Academies of Medicine, which compared US health to 17 peer developed countries. And this was their conclusion. The panel was struck by the gravity of its findings. For many years, Americans have been dying at younger ages than people in almost all other high-income countries. This disadvantage has been getting worse for 3 decades, especially among women. They go on to say the US health disadvantage cannot be explained by health disparities. Several studies are now suggesting that even advantaged Americans, those who are white, insured, college educated, or upper income, are in worse health than similar individuals in other countries. In fact, the National Bureau of Economic Research just showed this a couple months ago. This is a study they published in September looking at white mortality rates, Black mortality rates, and European mortality rates between 1990 and 2018. And they concluded, despite mortality improvements since 1990, white Americans have increasingly lost ground compared to Europeans, with substantial gaps in mortality rates opening between Europeans and white Americans. I'm going to skip through the data because I want to spare a little time, but I can talk about it in the Q&A. This is the PBS NewsHour asking why so many white Americans are dying young. This is the Wall Street Journal looking at declines in life expectancy for white Americans, particularly women. This is an article talking about deaths of despair, which is a term that was popularized by these two people, Angus Deaton and Ann Case, a married couple, economists at Princeton. Angus Deaton won the Nobel Prize in 2015 for economics. And they published this study looking now at mortality rates. Ideally, with mortality rates over time, you want to see them going down. And that's in fact what they showed for many countries and many US populations, except for US whites, which is that bright red line towards the top, where you see it started on the same basic trajectory in the 90s as the rest of these other populations, but then all of a sudden started to balloon up. And the death rates are now exceeding what they were in 1990 for white Americans. This is somewhat unique and unusual. The causes of death are largely self-inflicted. They're suicide, their drug overdoses, and their alcohol-related mortality. And so this question about, is this just disparities is clearly answered insofar as it's all of us. We're all struggling with health challenges in this country, and we're experiencing profound declines in our life expectancy and other measures of our health status. We know that 80+%, it's really closer to 90% of what shapes your life expectancy and your health status happens outside of the reach of doctors and health systems. Why? The bottom line is stress. I'm going to say that again. The bottom line is stress. It's chronic stress. Chronic stress that's created by a failure of health protective policy. So we all experience stress. This concept of allostasis or allostatic load is basically how the body perceives something in the outside environment, takes it internally, and it changes our physiology. It may be inadequate transportation and long commutes, expensive housing that's unaffordable and poor quality. It may be being socially isolated. It may be experiencing racism. It may be having so-called high demand, low control jobs. It may be lacking access to basic amenities, parks, grocery stores, things that you need in order to live a healthy life. It may be experiencing crime. The body experiences these stressors the same way. This is how humans process stress. They perceive the stressor, which sends a message to the hypothalamus, which sends a message to the pituitary gland, which releases a cascade hormone to the adrenal glands, which then releases a cascade of hormones, including cortisol. Cortisol is one of the master hormones in the body. On the blue side of this graphic, when you're acutely stressed, cortisol helps stimulate your cardiac output. It rallies glucose for your muscles in case you need to fight or to flee. It enhances your immune functions. It's an immunosuppressive, so it turns down it's an anti-inflammatory, turns down your inflammatory response, and it stimulates the growth of neurons in your prefrontal cortex and in your hippocampus, which are necessary for what's called executive function, which is basically triage. It's basically making a very quick decision about what tool, what option you should select for the moment that you're in. However, if you're constantly exposed to cortisol, like in those maps I showed you, those red neighborhoods where life expectancy is low, where people are chronically being threatened by policy, by lacking access to basic things like grocery stores and safe streets and affordable housing, and in some cases, even potable water coming out of their taps. In those communities, those people are constantly stressed out. And when cortisol is constantly circulating, it does something different. It actually causes direct hypertension and cardiovascular disease, as well as indirectly, it stimulates cravings for high fat, high salt, high sugar foods. So you get a double whammy from chronic cortisol circulation. It causes glucose intolerance and insulin resistance, which are precursors for type 2 diabetes. It causes increased inflammation, turns down your immune response, makes you more prone to diseases like COVID-19, and it causes atrophy and cell death in parts of the brain that I told you are responsible for executive function. So let me sum this up by offering you a framework for trying to understand how to grapple with these things. The traditional framework, and again, the traditional framework is focused on behaviors, genetics, and access to healthcare. And that's basically the medical model. And in that framework, it says that people's risk behaviors and risk factors, like maybe congenital disease, make them at higher risk for morbidity, illness, sickness, and injury. And when you're at higher risk for morbidity, you're at higher risk for mortality. So the primary explainer of these early deaths in these communities in the medical model context has got to be one of these three things, because to a hammer, everything is a nail. So it's got to be about genetics, it's got to be about access to healthcare, or it's got to be about behaviors. And what we have recognized in a sort of a larger public health approach is that that is true, but not in any way sufficient to explain the phenomenon that we're seeing at the population level, particularly as the United States continues to trend downwards against its peer countries in the world in terms of health status. We recognize that there's a socio-ecological context, which is not about individuals, it's really about populations, and it's shaped by policies. And what we recognize there is a narrative that says that some people belong and others don't, leads to policies that are created by institutions that essentially steer resources towards those that are preferred and away from those that are disfavored. And that has health costs. So when you talk about health disparities, you're talking about a downstream phenomenon, but upstream, we're talking about health inequities, which are structural, which are driven by policy and policy decisions. You can take the word health out and talk about inequities producing disparities. If you're simple-minded like me, you talk about conditions producing consequences, and those consequences downstream are a multi-trillion-dollar enterprise in healthcare and growing. In fact, downstream could be thought of as really kind of damage control from the failure upstream to invest in a meaningful social contract. These downstream consequences manifest not just in the health space, they manifest in the education space. Our argument has been, let's focus on what we can actually do upstream and try to have an influence. We've simplified our upstream opportunities to really three. One is shaping the narrative, the story of who we are and what we need to do together. That is a critical piece to shaping policy, which is the second domain where health protective policies and the health consequences of non-health policies are relevant in this space, and we need to understand them. And then finally, place, the communities, the workplaces where people find themselves on throughout most of their day trying to navigate a healthy existence. We know how to create environments that are conducive to health. We just choose not to for certain populations, and it has consequences for all of us. What's critical in this is power. As I mentioned, these are political decisions that lead to this distribution or maldistribution of health protective resources. So helping communities develop social, political, and economic power and a critical mass of folks is a critical health intervention at the population level. Okay, healthcare costs live downstream, true health lives upstream. The name of this game is to bring some of those costs upstream and create what is a virtuous cycle. Right now, we have a downward spiral ending in the emergency room. So let me just conclude simply: structural racism and its legacy create and maintain racial health inequity. That is just apparent when you look at the data. White health is steadily collapsing in the United States, primarily as a result of collateral damage from structural racism. It's essentially the absence of solidarity between groups that leads to the failure of us investing in universal policies like universal health care. And that's the reason that we're the only industrialized country in the world that lacks universal health care. It's the reason that we lack paid sick leave. It's this notion that I don't want to pay for that guy. I just want to pay for my guys. Third, improving American health will require rebuilding our social contract, investing in social benefits and services that buffer and protect our health. And finally, the first step towards rebuilding the American social contract is strengthening our narrative of inclusion, talking about the larger we and how our fates are inextricably intertwined, acknowledging our history and recognizing that we have to move forward differently. Let me conclude there, and hopefully we have some time for some questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Iton. That was amazing and well done in a short period of time. There are, in fact, a few questions for you. So let me get to the first couple. Can you comment on the relationship between social determinants of health and epigenetic changes in individuals in communities with lower social investment?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for that. I should say that I don't really like the term social determinants of health because I think it doesn't explain how they're distributed. I prefer the term political determinants of health because all of these determinants are, again, distributed across political systems. And so it matters who you are in terms of how much of that determinant you're going to be allocated really in a political process. So the less power you have, the less likely you're going to be able to get, housing or education or employment. And epigenetics has been fascinating. I think the work of Arlene Geronimus at the University of Michigan has been particularly interesting in this regard, looking at telomere length in various different populations. Telomeres are kind of the physical manifestation of epigenetics in terms of how genes are expressed or suppressed. And there is some evidence that chronic stress actually shortens telomeres and contributes to essentially shortened lives, sort of premature aging or weathering, as Arlene Geronimus refers to it. And there is a little bit of evidence that actually reducing that stress actually then lengthens telomeres. So we do believe that there are physical, essentially chromosomal manifestations of chronic stress. Measuring them is challenging, but to the extent that that's being done, there are a number of researchers around the country that are trying to figure that out. Arlene Geronimus is the one that I know most about, and they have some fascinating research in that regard.
Awesome. Thank you so much. The next question, it particularly appeals to the old dog in the audience here. Has social media been studied for possible association with increased American mortality? Interesting, they note that Facebook launched in the early 2000s, which kind of correlates with the graph.
I have never had that question before, and that's a fascinating question. I'm going to look into that. I think that's very interesting, and I'll tell you why. And this may be why you're asking the question. Part of the challenge that we have in this country is balkanization. This idea of sort of tribalism, that, I only care about me and my people, and those other people are a threat to me and my people. And social media actually contributes to balkanization insofar as it allows people to get information only from people who think like them. So no longer do we have kind of sort of shared consensus facts on major happenings in this country. Same event happens, and the factual analysis of it is completely different in different camps, if you will. So I think the question is a brilliant one, and I think it deserves some study. And maybe somebody's already studying it. I'll have to ask around. But I do think that sort of factionalism, that balkanization, the tribalism is exacerbated by social media, as we've seen with COVID-19 and the politicization of masks and vaccines, of issues that had traditionally been completely nonpartisan and very much in the domain of public health.
Interesting. Thank you. Well, we'll look forward to your thoughts about that at some point in the future, as well as you can dig in a bit. There's a lot of practitioners of various sorts on the presentation today, and we'd be interested to see what sort of practical implications various practitioners might have in their day-to-day healthcare role.
Yeah, typically, I mean, I'm a doctor. I practice rarely these days, but you know, that's my identity. I'm an internist. And there are three things that I think are really important. And I'll start with the highest level because, you know, I think it's, in some ways, it's the most salient to this talk. And that is that physicians, nurses, people in the healthcare space still have a lot of credibility. COVID has eroded some of that, but there's a lot of credibility. And when physicians and healthcare practitioners speak on policy issues, they bring kind of the imprimatur of science to those issues. And so having physicians participate in policy debates, writing op-eds, giving testimony, you know, speaking publicly about the implications of various different policies, housing policies, health insurance policies, education policies, tax policies on health, has a profoundly impactful influence on decision makers. There still is an enormous amount of deference given to sort of the professionalism of healthcare practitioners, because we in general are not biased. We're not looking to make money off of these things for the most part. So we carry a fair amount of credibility. So that's one. And you know, we in fact support the California Medical Association's program that helps physicians essentially learn how to write op-eds and how to participate in policy, how to give testimony, you know, how to influence legislation from a health perspective. But I think the simpler ways are, we always say, start where you are. And where you are is, you know, in a clinic, in a hospital, or in some sort of healthcare setting for the most part. And even in that setting, there are opportunities to change the way that we practice medicine in a way that actually acknowledges, A, the expertise of the patients before us who are living in these societies and experiencing this allostatic load, and sort of flipping the script a little bit, allowing people sort of, one of the things that's done that I think is particularly helpful to this is having group visits. You know, where patients can actually serve as mentors and experts to other patients that are similarly situated, and they can use their experience navigating their environment, for instance, in how to exercise, how to find healthy food, you know, how to navigate, you know, mental health issues, you know, walking clubs that are created, cooking groups that are created amongst patients with diabetes. All of that is a way of sort of like bringing out kind of the collective wisdom of people that have navigated these environments so that they can actually share their expertise with others. And that's called agency. When you have agency, it's like this notion of control. What we've seen is that agency is very critical for health at the individual level, at the family level, and the community level. People want to be able to influence the things that are happening in their world and not just have things happening to them. And then, you know, I think that, you know, clinics, hospitals are neighbors. They live in a neighborhood. They ought to be concerned about the quality of amenities in that neighborhood. What are the grocery stores like? What are the parks like? What are the bike lanes like? What's the housing stock like? These institutions can participate in helping to build a healthy community, both through investing directly, but also in articulating what is important to health. So those are the three things that I think about, you know, physicians, healthcare providers, participating actively in the policy space, lending that credibility to issues that are important to public health. Two, in the clinical space, thinking about changing the dynamics of that relationship between physician and patient so that the so-called patient feels more agency and control and can participate in helping shaping the health of others. And then three, institutions as neighborhood actors and having an investment in that neighborhood and a say and a concern about the quality of that neighborhood. I showed you the pictures of Johns Hopkins, which is touted as one of the best medical schools in the world, and it's a good school, but the neighborhood around Johns is a shame. It's an embarrassing atrocity that has been that way for over 40 years. So the influence of Johns Hopkins on the immediate neighborhood in East Baltimore has been, if anything, not positive.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your presentation today and your thoughtful answers to the questions. It was very enlightening. There are many positive comments. Let me just share with you in the chat box. So thank you very much for taking the time today. We really appreciate the information you've imparted.
Thank you for having me.